All right, got it. Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Gerrish. Obviously, I know a few of you. Most of you I might not, especially if there's only a first name there. Bart. Which Bart is that? I don't know. I know a lot of guys named Bart. All right. Holly had said I should say something about myself quickly. I grew up a flatland Illinois crop farmer, but I got over it. I had nothing to do with cattle when I was growing up. We were corn, soybeans, wheat, and hogs. Real classic. I oddly enough ended up studying forages when I went to college more than corn and soybeans. And as they say, the rest is history. I spent 22 years, 3 months on the University of Missouri faculty working in pasture and grazing management research. Through 20 plus of those years, my wife Dawn and I and our 4 kids, we didn't have them in one package, all 4 kids at once. It's stretched out over time. We had our own farm there where we practiced what I preached. And then in 2003, midlife crisis hit, and I quit the university and we moved off to an exotic location. That was Idaho. And it was a recreational lifestyle move. I tell everybody if my life's ambition was to be in the cattle business, I would have stayed in Missouri. And I really didn't think when we came to Idaho that I'd be involved in day-to-day ranching operations again, but we fell into a deal with a neighboring ranch by the little property that we bought. The manager was a ranching for profit graduate and was in an EL group. And when I met him at a benefit dinner and dance down at the fire hall shortly after we moved, he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "We bought the Slominski place," and ended up, I worked with that ranch, lived on their property, and ran grazing on one of their satellite units for 18 and a half years. And then last spring, a year ago, this April, we abandoned ranching and moved to just a little property in the Big Lost Valley. And now all I do is walk in the hills, hang out, and occasionally talk to people on podcasts and webinars and stuff like that. I think that fully explains who I am. Now, Polly, are you going to ask me leading questions or something?
No, this is an open forum. If you want to talk about the Augustus study, if you want, we don't have to. But honestly, I just think that this is like an open forum for anybody to ask you questions. If there's
Okay.
something that you have seen this summer that maybe would be of interest to people or anything, yeah, I just think let's just open it up and have just an honest conversation.
Okay. I will say something about the paper that David Augustine and group published in 2020 about the applicability of adaptive grazing management to Western rangelands. When Holly first contacted me, it's been several months ago now, that was what was on her mind and what she wanted to talk about. And so I spent 20 plus years in the academic research circles in grazing management, but it was in the humid Midwest, high rainfall environment, highly productive stuff. And we saw tremendous responses to, the term I coined back in 1989 was management intensive grazing. And we always put that hyphen in there between management and intensive because we want to emphasize that's management that's being intensified, not the grazing. I didn't know a lot about the West. I traveled out here on vacation and made a few visits to speak at various seminars or conferences and things. And I started being a regular instructor in the University of Idaho's Lost River Grazing Academy in 1997. And so we started coming out here, seeing more, and we kindly decided we ought to just live out here, 2004 is when we moved to Idaho. And I left the university in 2003, got out of research and outreach and came out west and got more involved in ranching out here, did a lot of consulting work out here. And I have to say, I probably learned more from my consulting clients in Montana, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and all that than maybe they got from me. But man, did I get an education in Western ranching. And then I had the opportunity to manage one unit of a larger ranch in central Idaho. And we did that for 18 and a half years. And again, I got to learn a lot. So I became very familiar with Western rangeland operations. And by Western, I got to say, for those of you who don't know, when you get west of basically Lincoln, Nebraska, a line from Lincoln, Nebraska through Dallas, Fort Worth, every 25 miles west you go, the rainfall drops by, every 20 to 25 miles, it drops by an inch. And I basically consider the West everything west of that line where precipitation starts dropping. Yeah, there's still some outfits. Of course, the far east side of that getting 30 inches of precip. Where we lived in the Pacific Valley in Idaho, 7 to 8 inches was the annual precipitation. So it was a cultural shock. But as I say, I learned a lot of things. And one of the things I learned was what actually happens out on a ranch and what the academic research says should happen or might happen, or what their investigations show happen, are two very different things. And in 2020, there was this paper published, which it's basically called The Role of Adaptive Management in Rangelands, Semi-Arid Rangelands. And there'd been a lot of complaints over the last 15, 20, 30 years that academic research never actually reflected what was going on ranches. And that has been my experience, that what I read in the Journal of Range Management and hear a lot of classic range scientists report is quite different than what I see happening on actual ranches. So in the circles that talk about stuff like this, it's always referred to as the Augustine paper, because David Augustine was the senior author on that paper. 10 years earlier, there had been the Brisky paper, because David Brisky was the senior author on it. And the Brisky paper, they did some research looking at time-controlled grazing management in contrast to set stocking on rangeland, and basically saw a little benefit to it. But Brisky's paper took a lot of criticism from some of the more progressive ranchers that they didn't do this, they didn't do that, they should have considered this, this was not a good design. And Augustine tried to do a research project that addressed a lot of those concerns, and they did a pretty good job on a lot of it. And like I said, I read that paper when it first came out 4 years ago, read it a couple of years ago, and then I read it again this afternoon. And I would hate to think that I wasted an hour and a half of my time ahead of this podcast if I didn't say something about it. So I always emphasize that we manage grazing in both space and time. And the position, so I've been in this for over 45 years now, this kind of work. And I've come to the realization, conclusion, say it how you will, that the management of time is actually more important than the management of space when it comes to grazing management. And that, I think that's true whether we're talking about productive pastures in the high rainfall eastern environment, irrigated pastures here in Idaho, or rangeland. That time is more important than space. Augustine and his colleagues in the project, that they did a very good job of trying to address the issue of time management, and I give them credit for that. From that standpoint, the project is well designed. I find no statistical flaws in their analysis. If I had one thing that I would criticize in that study, all right, so I'm going to paint the picture here. We have a 4,000 acre ranch that is split into 10 400 acre pastures, and we're going to rotate yearlings through that, doing all of the things that regenerative grazing experts talk about. And they did a pretty good job of that, I think. And then they had 4,000 acres of set stocked rangeland. And it was split up so that soil types were similar through those plant communities were similar. But the problem is that they created 10 400 acre continuously grazed ranches rather than a single unit of 4,000 acres that was set stocked. And whereas our classic Society of Range Management Scientists have really focused on spatial management, just get the stocking rate right and everything will be cool. This particular project looked at things really focusing on the context of time, but not so much space. And 10 400 acre ranches, animal performance wise, grazing distribution wise, is not going to be the same as a single 4,000 acre ranch. And the reason I say that is we look at a lot of these ranches of that scale, and on that 4,000 acres, there's a total of 5 watering points, maybe. Sometimes it's only 2. 5 would be a common number. And going to some classic grazing distribution work done at Texas A&M by Rick Mockins and his team, basically they found that 0 to 1/2 mile away from the water point, you have nice even distribution and uniformity of grazing. And then as you move greater distance away from the water point, utilization falls way off. And had the Augustine study been done with a single herd grazing through 4,000 acres that only had 5 watering points on it, I believe there'd been a very different result in their study. There was a fella, Ben Norton, who was at Utah State University, range scientist there. He had written a paper about 2000, maybe in the late 1990s, that explained this dichotomy of why academic research never seemed to match up with what real ranch experience was. And he emphasized the point that the spatial distribution of the animals was a big factor in the results. And his point being that the continuous grazing pastures in these kind of studies were always too small, that you never got into that real world situation that so many of us experience, that it's just too far from water for the animals to go and use the top of that ridge. Ben Norton did that, and that was one of the first exposures I had to this ongoing conflict within the range management community in the West. And I think, as I said, that the Augustine paper did a real good job of trying to avoid the confounding of the time management factor, but they ended up confounding the spatial deal. Holly, that's what I wanted to say about the Augustine paper. It was a well-designed, overall, it was well-designed, it was properly analyzed, but they still did not mimic what happens in the real ranching world. Questions, comments, discussion?
Yeah, Jim, I want to jump in really quick and say that I'd like to coin a new phrase. And I see Mickey Stewart is on this call as well, and I'd love for her to chime in on this. But I'd like to introduce recovery intensive grazing. And I just want to get your comments on, Mickey, I'm queuing you up here. Why don't we ever study? All we talk about is how many cows for how long. And they do mention frequency sometimes, but that's when do the cows come back? And I think we ought to look at when are the plants fully recovered, because that's the only thing to me that matters. And this is just my opinion, of course, but have we ever studied that?
Mickey, if you care to comment, I'll let you go. Are you there?
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay. In the Augustine study, what they tried to do, and so their adaptive management was actually all the decisions were made by a team of 11 individuals, 4 ranchers, 4 public agency range managers, and the other 3 were, I don't remember what, but they had the option to allow extended recovery on however many pastures they wanted to do every year. So they had 10 pastures to work with, and typically they were leaving like 2 with no grazing at all. This project, by the way, for those of you who don't know, it was done in northern Colorado, very close to where Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado all intersect. 14-inch precipitation environment, as I recall. And so the adaptive management team, they could allow pastures to recover to whatever extent. Chris, I would say they were looking at the recovery aspect, and the study basically concluded there was no benefit to that year of non-use. Okay. My general recommendation is you can plan 1 grazing event per 10 inches of precipitation. So at 14-inch precipitation, I think it would have been appropriate to have grazed every pasture every year, but then you graze them in different sequences year to year. So your recovery time might be as short as 7 months, and it might be as long as 18 or 19 months. And so that's where the flexibility in recovery is. One other thing I didn't like about the Augustine study, and one year, 2015, exceptionally good production year, they only used 4 out of the 10 pastures. So 6 pastures were given a full year recovery. I think in the real world of ranching, if we saw that good of production year, we'd have bought 500 more yearlings rather than letting those 6 pastures sit idle. And I think that was an opportunity, a management opportunity that wasn't captured in that study that a real world rancher would have done, is rather than letting 6 pastures sit idle and unused, we'd have taken at least 4 of those pastures and stocked them to the appropriate norm so that we were rotating through 8 pastures rather than just 4. I think in the Augustine study, they tried to address recovery, but it ended up being over rested rather than just appropriately recovered. Mickey, do you have something to contribute now?
I think where Chris was trying to go, based on conversations that we've had in the past, is that if you make the assumption that grasses are adapted to being grazed, that something that hasn't been grazed can't recover because it hasn't been grazed. And the
Excellent point. Excellent point. Both Chrissy and Mickey and Chris. Yeah. No, I agree.
And that and then further from that is that the plant needs to have access to soil moisture so the roots can do their root thing. So the two criteria or the two ingredients would be, one, the vegetation would be grazed. That
Mhm.
is the first part of the definition of recovery. And the second part of the definition of recovery is that there would be soil moisture to allow for regrowth and storing of resources in the roots. To talk about, and I'm with you on the over-rest thing, to talk about recovery without talking about utilization doesn't make intuitive sense
Yeah.
to me.
I agree with everything that you said there. And coming back to this criteria that I use when I'm talking with ranchers about grazing frequency or at a meeting, that everything is driven by moisture availability, and that 10 inches that I use, I think it's a conservative point. But there's a whole lot of our neighbors who need to have a little bit of guidance on how they're managing, and that number works for me. But you're exactly right. Recovery is moisture dependent, and all grassland plants evolved with large herbivore grazing. And if we remove that, we are going to disrupt the ecosystem processes. Yeah, point well taken. Others? That's just seeing what that message in chat was, whether it was a question or not. No, it's just Holly trying to encourage people to get involved. That's why we're here. Yeah.
Well, it always takes
Hey,
a bit
Jim.
for 'em to get warmed up. Go ahead, Rick.
Rick Coughlin, Jim. Good to hear you tonight.
Happy
Would
to
you
be
talk
here.
a little bit? Would you talk a little bit about how you feel percent utilization affects recovery time?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Utilization affects recovery time. And I'll draw some extremes here. When I was in Missouri, and you'll probably get tired of hearing me say that, I was a classic take half, leave half thinker. And that was in a productive high rainfall environment. Before I moved west, I thought take half, leave half was just, that's what you do on rangeland, regardless of what the production was. And what I've come to learn is this idea that what you leave behind is more important than what you take. And we have worked towards a sliding scale of utilization targets based on what the range productivity is. To give you an example, there has to be, in my mind, and based on my experiences that I've had across these environments over the last 20 years or so, is we do not even consider taking 50% unless the total annual production from that site is over 2,000 pounds per acre. Now, let's think about a lot of places in the semi-arid West, like the Pacific Valley, where our annual precipitation is just 7 to 8 inches, and the total annual forage production is typically 400 to 600 pounds, according to the Web Soil Survey. If we took 50% of that, I think it would be devastating to the plant community and the landscape. And so when we are at a productivity level like that, 20% is the maximum that I would consider appropriate utilization. And then we basically work from 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, we'd be at 45% utilization, 1,250 to 1,540, and so off, working down. As the total biomass production goes down, our utilization rate has to go down. Otherwise, we have nothing left to build litter. We have nothing left to support recovery. And I think recovery rate is very closely tied to the degree of utilization. And if we want to have strong recovery and healthy rangelands, we got to back off on that utilization target. Does that make sense, Rick?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I want to do a follow-up if that's okay.
Okay, yep, absolutely.
It's September here in central Montana. I guess it is September everywhere.
Right now in the UK, it's October.
True. More or less September everywhere.
Okay,
Animals are out grazing. Now talk to us about the value of the percentage of the utilization they take. What I'm getting at is right now,
okay,
we did get a little bit of green up, and if we hadn't grazed the pasture all year, you see where I'm going?
yeah.
I'll let you go from there.
All right.
Thank you.
If we have a pasture that has been recovering, growing undisturbed through most of the growing season, it is going to be today at a state of fully recharged storage carbohydrates. When we first moved to Idaho in 2004, and I got involved with grazing these pivots in the fall of 2004, and the subsequent years, we basically shut down the pivots, drained everything out on the last day of summer, because in the next week it was going to be freezing and freezing hard. Now, in the intervening 20 years that I've been here, fall comes later and later. I think that's been a general trend across most of the West and in the Northeast as far as that goes. It's just fall is coming later. All right. So I used to be very comfortable with the idea that dormant season started the 1st of October, and I could pretty well treat any pasture, any range unit like it was in dormancy anytime after October 1st. Now that onset of the dormant season comes later. And I think one of the worst things that we could do on rangeland is right here at the tail end. It's not really growing yet or growing still, but to graze it severely before the dormant season onsets, if we get a little bit of fall rain, it's going to try to regrow, and that's going to draw down on stored carbohydrates and weaken that plant. I think as we go through the month of October here, we got to be pretty conservative on utilization and really not think that we can treat that plant like it's in dormancy. We got to treat it like it still wants to grow. Whereas maybe we were looking at 30 to 40% utilization target if it was truly dormant, we better be backed off to 20%, because I think we can hurt the spring vigor of the range by grazing it just a little too aggressively in October. And I didn't grow up in this environment. I think a lot of folks who have grown up in this environment think that, okay, October, it's dormant, I can graze it a little more aggressively. I don't think we can think that way anymore. We got to be adapting to how this seasonality is changing. Okay, I see we have some questions in chat, so I'm going to jump over here and look at some of those. So Haley asked, can you talk a little bit about the difference between grazing horses and cattle? Absolutely, I can. Horses are the most destructive animal on pasture and range if we allow them to be. And it's because they have two sets of teeth. I would say a horse can graze 1.5 inches below the soil surface and still meet its needs. Horses can graze very aggressively. And then the fact that they're not ruminants, rumination is more of a batch processing system. The animal eats a bunch, then it lays around, ruminates and all that. And they have to have time in the day for grazing, for rumination, and because those are both energy demanding processes, they have to have time for rest. A horse, as a hind gut fermenter, is more of a flow-through system. And so horses can literally graze 20 hours a day, whereas a bovine or an ovine, a bovine's limited to a maximum of 8 to 10 hours. Ovine can go up 14 or so, but horse can just graze. And horses are And no, I don't hate horses or anything like that. I just recognize the reality that given to their own devices, they are the most destructive animal on rangeland that there is. Haley's question was small acreage, 2 horses, what to do? Horses should probably be in their stall. I hate to say this because to me it's a little bit not nice to the animal, but horses should probably be in their stalls 20 hours a day, let out to graze just for a little bit to get them some fresh grass, some exercise on that. Because on a small acreage, everybody thinks that they can run a horse or 2. Why not 5? I've got these mares and they have foals and they're all so nice. Now I'm up to 8. And then the land is just degraded. If you're on small acreage with horses, I hate to say it, but they need to be stalled most of the time. And most of their feed probably, and it depends on what your land area actually is, but most of their feed coming from harvested feed and just enough grass to keep them interested in life and happy. Haley, you got any follow-up on that? Okay. And then Bart says, everyone talks about recovery, but I don't hear a lot of definition on what recovery looks like. It definitely depends. Man, you stole my word, buddy. But what do folks use for standards of recovery on irrigated and upland native? Okay. The way I talk about recovery is whether the plant is in a negative or a positive carbohydrate balance. And that has to do with, do we have a negative carbohydrate balance? Is when the plant does not have adequate leaf area for enough photosynthesis to support active new growth plus restore storage carbohydrates. A positive carbohydrate balance is new growth is being driven by active photosynthesis and the plant has enough excess energy to restore its reserve organs. And to say root reserves is a misnomer because a lot of bunch grasses primary storage is in the stem bases above ground. Okay, so what defines that? On most cool season grasses, so orchard grass, brome grasses, fescue, timothy, ryegrass, that's going to be at least 3 actively growing leaves on the plant. If there are 3 or more leaves, it's in a positive carbohydrate balance. If there's fewer than 3, it's probably in a negative carbohydrate balance. On the like tall native prairie grasses, the big blue stem, Indian grass, things like that, which are bunch grasses with elevated carbohydrate storage, we probably need a minimum of 4 or 5 leaves on those for them to be fully recovered. So cool season grasses, you can graze if they have reached that 3 leaf stage. My preference is to let them go to 4 or 5 leaves. And on the native tall grasses, 6 or 7 leaves. Okay. Any follow-up on that, Bart?
Yeah, I just have one follow-up on that, and that's what we usually on our cool seasons, we usually do 4 to 5 leaves on that. And then natives, we give them way more than that. But a lot of times looking at this irrigated stuff, when you have 3 or 4 leaves on it, that's one bite and it's down to the dirt there. And so to me, there's also a piece of the status of that plant. And there's all these other bad things that happen if you remove those 3, 4 leaves in one bite, and then you don't have your soil armor, et cetera, you lose that microclimate, all that.
Okay. My experience has been, if we're grazing at the 3-leaf stage on irrigated cool season pastures, yeah, their bite takes it down to maybe 1.5 inches to 2 inches. If we get that 4 or 5 leaves out there, the natural shear point in the grass, which is defined by where indigestible fiber and lignin is elevated to, that first bite will take it and leave it at 3 to 5 inches, depending on the species. And that's why it's so important that our management is geared towards, they take 1 bite and then they move on. And usually if you're at the appropriate stock density on a 1-day move, moving them every 24 hours, we can find where that point is and we can maintain it. If we're just a little too high in our stock density and they take that second bite off of there, then we drop it down to that 1 to 3 inch residual height. And we always talk about grazing management as an art and a science. I can go on for hours and hours talking about the science of this stuff. The art is when you figure out on your own property what that stocking and what that move frequency needs to be to accomplish your objective of building some plant litter, soil armor, leaving the proper residual for rapid recovery. That's the art part of it. And you will only learn that by doing. You can read a lot of books, you can watch a lot of YouTube videos, but you got to do it, make a few mistakes, make a few wins before you figure out exactly what that means. Okay. Chris asks, how often should plants be allowed to go to seed? Is this a good indicator of vigor and health to follow in terms of recovery as well? Bart had just asked about irrigated pasture. On irrigated pasture, your grass plants never need to go to seed because they are reproducing, maintaining the stand through tiller production. If it's a rhizomatous grass, the rhizomes. Very little reproduction from seed happens on irrigated pastures with grasses. Now, clovers, trefoil, vetches, anything like that probably need to periodically reseed. And so our grazing management on irrigated pastures there in the Pasture, it was based on every third year, we wanted 1/3 of our irrigated acres to have a long enough recovery period for the legumes to make seed. And that's typically 60 to 75 days. All right. So let's go to rangeland now. In a rangeland setting, very often, especially where we worked in the mountains, it's just a 45 to 60 day growing season. Everything that you're going to get happens in that time frame. But we might graze that rangeland, that upland range, for 8 months. Just because of the very restricted growing season, 50 to 80% of the areas, the units that we grazed, they were headed out, mature seed there very often. I personally do not think that just the fact that a grass went to seed is an indication of the health and vigor of that pasture. If I can get an upland range grass to give me 5 or 6 leaves in a year rather than just 3, now that I think is an indication of vigor and health. I've seen way too many overgrazed or severely grazed range grasses desperately try to put up that seed head just for survival, that I don't think the fact that it made a seed head is an indication of vigor in that case. It's an indication of desperation. But if you can count 5, 6 leaves on your tillers of, blue bunch wheatgrass or needlegrass or something, then you have a pretty vigorous plant. Okay. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to follow up with on that comment?
Just to go back to the question of using that as a recovery measure, should we be thinking about letting them go to seed at least once every 3 years or on some regular schedule?
Yeah. What would you describe the length of your growing season on upland range, especially if you get up the 5, 6, 7, 8,000 foot elevation? What's the duration of the grazing season? Or excuse me, what's the duration of the growing season?
It's about what you said, and even in lower elevations all across the eastern part of the state, because of moisture and how limited it is and when it falls, I would say that's the growing season across the whole part of the state.
Yeah, I think what's important is that you do not graze pastures in the same sequence every year. We ought to be starting and finishing at different points. And if you do that, every year, some percentage, and it might be as much as 2/3 of the rangeland that you graze is going to have gone to seed. We just want to make sure that's a different grazing unit, a different pasture that has the opportunity in each year to get there. I like 3-year cycles on a lot of stuff. And so if your growing season is 60 days, but you have to be 6 months, 180 days out on that particular unit, if each year you are changing the sequence of grazing, it's going to be 3 years before a particular subdivision gets grazed within the same time frame. And I think that does have a significant impact on the health and vigor of the pasture. All right, Pat Foss, what about those real world situations that have steep topography and perennial streams? I feel like duration of time that livestock have access to the stream is more important than the number of livestock, and perhaps the rest years needed in many situations in these pastures. I think that is well put, Pat. There's plenty of indication that there are, if we look at the steepness of the slope and how much rock cover is out there, whether or not livestock use that area. When we're trying to think about our appropriate stocking rate for that unit and what its carrying capacity is, we have to drop out those extreme slopes and rock covered areas and bring our expected stocking rate down to match up to carrying capacity. And then what you say about stream access, absolutely. The degradation of a lot of streams throughout the West is not because livestock were in there and grazed at some time. It is entirely due to the livestock being present there for way too long. And I think that's the fail point in BLM and Forest Service management, is they are still, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, they are still in this spatial management model where the only thing that matters is the stocking rate in that extended period of time. And what my experience has been is we can go in with a much higher number of livestock if we shorten the time that they're present, and we'll have less negative impact on a stream if we do that. Any follow-up on that? Okay. Toner, what are the implications of these points on public land grazing leases establishing? Okay. Yeah, this is what I'm saying. Until the public agencies change their mindset to time-based grazing management rather than simply spatial, I don't think we can fix the problems that are out there, because the problems are all created by the extended amount of time that they're present on that spot, not the number of animals that pass through there. Connor, you got any follow-up on that? All right.
I'm an absolute rookie. I work for an NGO that's partnered with ranchers, and we're trying to push back on a lot of environmental attacks, if you will, but with a lot of good faith ranchers trying to do the right thing, but up against agency limitations.
Yep, that's a common position for people that are doing the job that you're doing. Okay. Quentin, I like this. I have 6 to 7 saddle horses in a small pasture, and they're in for a while throughout the year before I move them. My grass grows and does good. I disagree with keeping horses locked up for 20+ hours a day. If you're pulling that off, I applaud you. I would be interested in knowing how many acres we're actually talking about, and whether it's irrigated or dry land. Are you there, Quentin? You can tell I got a lot of time discipline going on because I've done a lot of these things. Thank you, Quentin, for your comment. Like I said, if you're pulling it off, I'm happy for you.
While Jim is jumping back on here, I did want to mention that I put a link in the chat to a paper that was authored last year It's actually a really great literature review on grazing
Okay.
and soil health. And if anyone listens to the Art of Range podcast, you don't have to read the article. They have a really nice podcast, about an hour and a half long, that covers it with the authors and then a couple of grazing managers. Again, the Art of Range. And then this paper is called Ruminating on Soil Carbon. And the principal is Paige Stanley out of Colorado State.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. I haven't actually seen that one, so I'll take a look into it. All right, Daniel Miller. I work a lot in Mongolia where there is serious overgrazing and few trained range ecologists and even fewer range planners. What are the most important points we need to emphasize where there's no private land and herders don't trust each other? Daniel, I have had the privilege of going to Mongolia also, and what you describe is very consistent with what I saw there. We made no progress there. And I think all the herders, the nomads in Mongolia are aware of the problem that they're facing. Their government is aware of the problem that they're facing. And that nation lived so long under totalitarian rule and dictates on what they could and could not do on the rangeland. They are fiercely independent people, and I have no answer there. I went there thinking that I could help people, and I came away realizing that probably there's going to be first an ecological collapse of the native steppe there, which is going to be an economic collapse of Mongolia, and either China or Russia will move in because they don't want that kind of unrest on their border. I can't give a good ecological answer to what they should do there because it is a socio-economic problem that has to be resolved first before they can resolve the ecological problem. We got anything else coming up?
Jim, I'll ask that question. How do you handle that in a situation where you're part of a grazing association and you've got some different ideas and people don't trust each other?
Oh, man, maybe you got to get sociologists, ecologists in there and get you guys and gals all together on team building exercises and learning to trust and all of those things. So just going back in time, my training is as a hard scientist, and I thought rural sociologists and even ag economists were just pseudosciences, and we didn't have to take them seriously. And then the more and more that I began working with individual farmers and ranchers and then their family groups and all that, I came to realize that we probably need more sociologists working in ranching communities than we need range scientists. Surely that'll get some feedback. I'll add the last 3 graduate committees that I sat on when I was on the University of Missouri faculty, 2 were in sociology and 1 in economics. They were not crop science or animal scientists, graduate students. They were in those soft sciences. And that is what we really need to help our family farms and ranches continue in existence. Hello, is anybody out there?
Hey, if nobody's here, I'll jump in. This is Butch Gillespie, but what you just said, I really agree with. Communication is what makes the world go around, even though it's a tough thing to do sometimes.
It is, yeah.
But along those lines, when we get down to maybe only grazing 20%, 40%, whatever, how do we keep the bankers happy? To me, it seems to make this whole thing work, probably you have to have some real sacrifice and make some long-term investments. I can see in the long run where they probably will pay off. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. We have had a lot of our clients through the Western ranching region who have doubled their carrying capacity. Part of this is they made their land more productive, but the vast majority of that increase in carrying capacity was actually just from more effectively utilizing the entire landscape rather than just the piece of landscape that's close to water. And so if you double your productivity, dropping from 50% utilization to 30% utilization, you will still generate more total AUDs off the ranch than what the previous was doing. And so if you're creating greater productivity to begin with, you can get by financially with a lower utilization rate because you're still harvesting more than what the traditional system may have been giving you. That's what a lot of people don't get. So another piece of that Augustine study that I found really interesting, and maybe I've already said this. I already said this about the year that they only used 4 of their 10 pastures and allowed 6 to just sit there and recover. A real rancher would have capitalized on that opportunity and bought that many more stock to utilize those other pastures. And that's just more of that. If you have greater productivity, you can get by with lower utilization. That makes sense, Butch?
Yeah, my thought is that it's just in what I've been doing, it seems like maybe it takes a good 2 to 3 years to acclimate and turn that page to where you start getting that little bit of extra usage. So I think it does require at least some sacrifice up front to get more over time.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
that's hard to sell people on sometimes.
Yeah, part of that sacrifice is the financial one of putting in the investment in improved stock water distribution and either hard fences or virtual fencing to control where the animals are to get that more consistent distribution across the landscape. There is a cost associated with it, but the payoff is there's only been a couple of ranches that I've ever been called upon to go visit and try to develop a plan for them where I could not come up with anything that would be cost effective for them to do. One was in Eastern Oregon, one was in Northern Utah. And that's when I say to those people, have you considered moving to Missouri? Because the world is what, and I tell people a lot of times, if my life's ambition was to be in the cattle business, I never, ever would have left Missouri because it makes way more sense to be in particularly the cow-calf business in a place like Missouri than it does Montana or Idaho or Utah.
I'll make one last quick comment here, but I first started doing this some 50 odd years ago, and I was in Peace Corps, but I was in 150-inch rainfall belt in Ecuador, down on the coast. So things do work a whole lot better when you got lots of rain. Now we're in this 7 to 8 to maybe 9 inches of rainfall belt up here in north central Montana.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, too much rain has its whole set of downfalls. I like to be on the low to moderate side of precipitation. It is actually easier to manage there than it is on 7 or 8 inches or 70 to 80 inches. 20 to 30 inch environment to me is just lovely.
We literally had to hire people to come in and chop down with their machetes, hard labor, at least 2 to 4 times a year with elephant grass, just to get it back where cattle would consume it.
Yep.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, one of my brothers has a couple of grass farms on Hawaii, and they had one down towards Lapahoihoi, which is 120 to 140 inch precipitation. And yeah, they literally had to just keep beating back the guinea grass in order to create a quality of feed that animals could even use. The place they kept is working around more towards the drier side, and I think they still get 40 to 50 inches there, but it is a world easier to manage because the grass doesn't grow so fast. I see we have a couple more comments over here in the chat. Pat just made the comment about a community of practice where farmers and ranchers are willing to show success to other farmers and ranchers has some chance for success. Yeah, I think the peer learning opportunities are great. When I was at the rise of the grass-based pasture and grass-based dairy movement in the Midwest and Northeast, there were grazing networks that got together and typically once a month and had a pasture walk on somebody's place. They were very grassroots. They were very organic in the way they developed. And the best ones were those that had no outside agency steering them or doing that, just where producers got together to help each other. And that lateral learning from one another on these pasture walks is just tremendous. And then another comment from Tony: in the semi-arid West, what's the best ranching strategy if cow-calf isn't the ideal? There's a whole lot of this Western country that I see that is very definitely more stocker country than cow-calf, just because winters are too long and the cost of feeding a cow through the winter is too great. And 100 to 120 day stocker season might be the best financial opportunity for a lot of folks in that situation. All righty.
I think Bart I think Bart had a question.
All right.
Yeah, talking on recovery, and we have some south facing slopes. They also have north, south, and north facing, but they're predominantly south facing with cheatgrass on it. We're just north of you up here by Missoula, and we only have water in there in the spring, and so we still split it up and pretty big paddocks, but the way we've been using it is we'll use it every other year just to get a full year's recovery on it. And there's blue bunch and fescue and all that in there as well. And but we're hitting it every May to July 1st, because that's when we have the water. Yeah. What's your thoughts on recovery for that? If we're giving it a full year rest?
Yeah, it's a tough deal, but one of the classic holistic management principles is manage for what you want, not against what you don't want. And I've made this mistake myself on some ground that we had that had cheatgrass, and I tried very much to make high impact grazing when the cheatgrass was grazable. But I think, unfortunately, when you hit it in that window of time, the few perennials that we have out there that we're trying to reestablish, they get grazed too severely at that time also, and don't have the opportunity to recover. And when I shifted away from trying to use the cheatgrass when it was palatable and just let it go, to allow the perennials to have their spring opportunity to grow, I think we made more progress doing that. And then we would come back in the winter and utilize the developing perennials at that time and get some of the cheatgrass eaten maybe, but mostly just stomped down. And I decided to quit chasing cheatgrass and just allow the perennials to develop. And maybe I need another 20 or 30 years to get where I want to on that. But several years of not fighting the cheatgrass, I think we made more progress. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has had what their experience has been, and if they have tried that manage for what you want rather than against what you don't want when it comes to the cheatgrass situation. Nobody?
Yep. I could say, Jim, a neighbor of mine here in Big Timber, and I've heard this from several others as well, is a lot of times with cheatgrass, you need biomass, you need some cover there to protect the soil and not cheatgrass soils bare ground. So yeah, I think what you said, grazing it early, trying to keep it from going to seed, in conjunction with that, wasting some feed. It doesn't need necessarily be bale grazing, but if you can get some access to poor quality feeds, sometimes some old grass, 2-3-year-old hay, or somebody hays their CRP one year, feeding that out there on those areas and grazing it early. So this guy was calving on his cheatgrass and then supplement feeding out there and feeding extra. So he was stockpiling some waste forage. That combination seems to be pretty successful. I've heard several folks say that, especially that time of year when you're branding or calving, when the cheatgrass is going to seed anyway and growing real vigorously, is a good time to hit it.
Yeah. I always say we are all products of our own experience. And depending on the season, the landscape position and those things, I encounter people with very different points of view on how to tackle cheatgrass. I think it's a lifetime struggle, unfortunately, for most ranches out here. And if anything else going on?
I think we had a really good discussion, so I really
Good.
appreciate it very much. And yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to do it. Maybe we'll do it again sometime.
I think that would be great.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
All right. Y'all have a good evening, and I'm ready to call it a day.